In July 1944, while American soldiers bled on Pacific islands and European battlefields, 730 delegates in expensive suits gathered at a luxury resort in New Hampshire. They weren't there to plan military strategy or negotiate peace terms. They were there to redesign the architecture of global money itself. What they created in 22 days wasn't just a plan to rebuild war-torn economies. It was a financial system that would make the United States dollar the most powerful currency in human history, controlling the economic destiny of every nation on Earth for the next 8 decades. Every financial crisis you've lived through, every economic boom and collapse, traces back to the decisions made in that mountain hotel. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a conference most people have never heard of gave America what no empire in history ever possessed, the ability to print the world's money. And you'll see why that system is finally starting to crack. World War II destroyed more than cities and lives. It obliterated the global economic system. By 1944, Europe's industrial capacity had been reduced by 70%, unemployment in major European cities exceeded 50%, and inflation was running at rates that made money worthless. Germany's currency required wheelbarrows to buy bread, and even Britain, once the world's financial superpower, was effectively bankrupt. This devastation created a power vacuum unlike anything in modern history. Before the war, Britain's pound sterling had served as the world's reserve currency, backed by the gold standard and the British Empire's global reach. But the war cost Britain everything. By 1945, Britain had liquidated most of its overseas assets, accumulated massive debts, and lost the financial credibility that once made London the center of world finance. Into this vacuum stepped the United States, holding an almost unimaginable advantage. America controlled approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves by 1947, equivalent to roughly $24 billion in gold at 1947 prices. The U.S. economy was not just intact, but had actually grown during the war, expanding by 75% between 1940 and 1945. American factories, untouched by bombing, were producing half of the world's manufactured goods. This moment presented an extraordinary opportunity. The old order had collapsed. Desperate nations needed dollars to rebuild, and the United States could write the rules of a new system. But the architects of this new order understood something crucial. They couldn't simply impose American will through military force alone. They needed to create institutions and agreements that would make dollar dominance appear natural, inevitable, and even beneficial to other nations. They needed to make the world want American money. On July 1st, 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The conference was officially titled the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, and its stated purpose was to prevent the economic chaos that had followed World War I. The 730 delegates who gathered represented every Allied nation, from major powers like Britain and France to smaller nations like Ethiopia and the Philippines. The conference was dominated by two men with competing visions. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary British economist, led the British delegation with a bold proposal called the International Clearing Union. His plan envisioned a new international currency called the Bancor that would be used for all international trade, with neither gold nor any national currency holding dominant status. Under Keynes's system, both deficit and surplus nations would face pressure to balance their accounts, preventing any single nation from accumulating excessive power. Opposing him was Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. White's plan was simpler and more favorable to American interests. He proposed an international stabilization fund where member nations would contribute quotas based on their economic size, and the U.S. dollar, backed by gold at $35 per ounce, would serve as the primary international currency. Other currencies would maintain fixed exchange rates against the dollar, and the dollar alone would be convertible to gold. The negotiations were intense and often acrimonious. Keynes understood that White's system would cement American financial dominance for generations, but Britain's desperate economic position left him with little leverage. As one British delegate later recalled, "We came as beggars and left as beggars." The final agreement looked remarkably like White's original proposal, with only minor concessions to Keynes's concerns. The Bretton Woods Agreement established two major institutions. The International Monetary Fund would oversee the fixed exchange rate system with initial quotas totaling $8.8 billion, of which the United States contributed $2.75 billion, giving America approximately 31% of voting power and effective veto authority over major decisions. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, would provide loans for reconstruction with an authorized capital of $10 billion. But the true genius of the system lay in its structure. Under the agreement, all member currencies would maintain fixed exchange rates against the U.S. dollar within a narrow band. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, but only foreign governments and central banks could exchange dollars for gold, not private citizens. This meant the world needed dollars to conduct international trade, to hold as reserves, and to maintain currency stability. The implementation phase began in December 1945, when 29 nations ratified the agreement. By March 1947, the IMF and World Bank were operational, with the IMF establishing par values for member currencies. The system required massive amounts of dollar liquidity to flow into the global economy. Countries needed dollars to rebuild, to trade, and to back their own currencies. This created insatiable demand for America's currency. Early challenges emerged almost immediately. Europe's reconstruction proceeded slower than anticipated, and the dollar shortage became acute by 1947. This shortage wasn't an accident. It was built into the system's design. The only way for other nations to obtain sufficient dollars was through trade surpluses with America or American loans and investments abroad. This gave the United States enormous leverage over allied economies. The Bretton Woods system, as originally designed, collapsed on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon suspended dollar convertibility into gold. U.S. gold reserves had fallen from 70% of world reserves in 1947 to approximately 22% by 1971, while dollars circulating globally had mushroomed. Yet, rather than ending dollar dominance, Nixon's action transformed it into something even more powerful: a purely fiat-based reserve currency, backed solely by the strength and reach of the American economy. The petrodollar system, formalized through agreements with Saudi Arabia in 1973-1974, replaced gold backing with oil backing. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC members agreed to price oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and recycle their dollar earnings into U.S. Treasury securities and Western banks. This created perpetual dollar demand. Every nation needed dollars to buy oil, the lifeblood of industrial economies. The arrangement gave America what no Bretton Woods delegate could have imagined: the ability to run permanent trade deficits while maintaining currency strength. Today's financial architecture directly descends from those 1944 decisions. The IMF now has 190 member countries, with total quotas exceeding $661 billion, but the United States retains its effective veto with 16.5% of voting shares. The World Bank has evolved into a development institution, but dollar-denominated lending remains its core function. The U.S. dollar comprises approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves as of 2024, down from 72% in 2002, but still dominant. The SWIFT international payment system, established in 1973, became the operational backbone of dollar hegemony. Over 11,000 financial institutions in 200 countries use SWIFT to transmit payment messages, and approximately 42% of those transactions involve U.S. dollars. This gives America extraordinary power: the ability to impose financial sanctions by cutting countries or institutions off from the dollar payment system, effectively excluding them from global commerce. Modern parallels to 1944 abound in how the system self-perpetuates. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve provided unlimited dollar swap lines to foreign central banks, ensuring dollar liquidity even as American banks collapsed. This mirrored the original Bretton Woods logic: the world needs dollars, and America must supply them to maintain the system. The COVID-19 pandemic saw similar dynamics, with the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanding by $4.7 trillion between March 2020 and March 2022. Yet cracks are appearing in the architecture. The weaponization of dollar access through sanctions against Russia in 2022 accelerated de-dollarization efforts. China and Russia now conduct 90% of bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. The BRICS nations, controlling 42% of global population and 31% of global GDP, are actively developing alternative payment systems. Saudi Arabia has begun accepting yuan for oil sales, something unthinkable a decade ago. The structural privileges built into the 1944 system remain largely intact. America can run trade deficits that would destroy other currencies because foreign nations need dollars for reserves. The U.S. government can borrow at lower interest rates because global demand for dollar-denominated Treasury securities remains robust. American banks dominate international finance because dollars must flow through New York-based correspondent banking networks. These aren't temporary advantages. They're embedded in institutional structures created 80 years ago. The system's stress points are multiplying in ways that echo the late 1960s Bretton Woods crisis. U.S. federal debt exceeds $34 trillion in 2024, representing 123% of GDP, while the dollar's share of global reserves has declined 14 percentage points since 2002. Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin identified this paradox in 1960. A reserve currency issuer must run deficits to supply global liquidity, but those deficits eventually undermine confidence in the currency. The dilemma that collapsed Bretton Woods 1.0 is reasserting itself. 3 potential futures are taking shape. Scenario 1 involves managed transition, where America gradually shares monetary power through expanded IMF special drawing rights or multilateral reserve arrangements. This would require American political leaders to voluntarily surrender privileges that no empire has willingly relinquished. The precedent is not encouraging. Britain fought desperately to maintain sterling's role even as the pound collapsed between 1945 and 1967. Scenario 2 involves crisis-driven reset, the historical norm for monetary transitions. The 1944 Bretton Woods system emerged from World War II's devastation. The 1973 petrodollar system arose from the collapse of dollar-gold convertibility. Major monetary shifts typically occur during emergencies, when defending existing arrangements becomes untenable. A severe U.S. fiscal crisis, a major geopolitical conflict, or a catastrophic loss of confidence could trigger sudden systemic change. Scenario 3 is gradual fragmentation, where regional monetary blocs emerge without formal agreement. The European Union created the euro, now the second largest reserve currency, at 20% of global reserves. China's Belt and Road Initiative is building yuan-denominated trade zones across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Digital currencies, whether central bank digital currencies or private cryptocurrencies, could enable payment systems that bypass traditional dollar channels entirely. Historical precedent suggests who typically wins such transitions. Britain's pound sterling dominated from roughly 1815 to 1914, backed by industrial supremacy, naval power, and colonial reach. As British economic dominance waned after World War I, sterling clung to reserve status through institutional inertia and the gold standard until crisis forced change. The dollar's rise occurred not through formal agreement alone, but because America possessed overwhelming productive capacity and military power. The next reserve currency will likely require similar comprehensive dominance, not just financial engineering. Here's what most analysis of Bretton Woods misses. The system was never really about promoting free trade or preventing another Great Depression. Those were the public justifications that made other nations accept American monetary hegemony. The real goal, understood by White and his colleagues, was to lock in American economic dominance for generations by making the entire world dependent on dollars. The documents reveal this intent clearly. In a 1941 memo to Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, White wrote that the new monetary system should strengthen our position as a world creditor and increase the dependence of other nations on our exports. This wasn't stabilization. It was strategic empire building through financial architecture rather than military conquest. 3 lessons emerge from this history that remain relevant today. First, monetary systems reflect power relationships, not economic optimality. The dollar dominates because America dominated in 1944 and entrenched that dominance through institutions. Second, path dependence is extraordinarily strong in monetary affairs. Switching currencies imposes massive coordination costs, explaining why the dollar persists despite America's relative economic decline. Third, systemic change requires either overwhelming force or catastrophic failure. Gradual, orderly transitions in reserve currency status rarely occur. This history matters now because we're approaching another inflection point. The combination of rising U.S. debt, accelerating de-dollarization, and emerging alternative payment systems suggests the 1944 settlement is finally unraveling. Whether that produces managed evolution, crisis-driven transformation, or gradual fragmentation will shape global economics for the next generation. Understanding how we got here is essential to understanding where we're heading. The secret meeting in 1944 didn't just give America unlimited money. It created a system where unlimited money printing became necessary to maintain the global financial architecture. That system generated unprecedented prosperity for some and unprecedented control for America. But as with all empires, the mechanisms that secured dominance eventually become the constraints that accelerate decline. How $13 billion saved Europe from communism. The Marshall Plan's hidden architecture. Explore how America used Reconstruction aid to cement dollar dominance and create permanent customer states in Europe, completing the financial empire designed at Bretton Woods.